On July 20th, 1969, an estimated 650 million people watched a grainy black and white television feed of a man stepping onto another celestial body. Across every continent, radios crackled, televisions illuminated packed living rooms, and city squares fell dead silent. It was presented to humanity as the ultimate triumph of human curiosity. But behind the serene words of peace and the poetic celebration of human potential was a cold, calculated reality. The Apollo program was never primarily about astronomy, geology, or pure science. It was the most expensive, high-stakes psychological warfare campaign ever waged. To understand why 12 men walked on the lunar surface, you have to look past the rockets and look at the brutal geopolitical chess match that defined the mid-20th century. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the globe was carved in half. On one side stood the United States, championing democratic capitalism. On the other stood the Soviet Union, presenting communism as the inevitable future of human civilization. The newly liberated, decolonizing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were watching closely, trying to decide which superpower offered the superior model for the modern world. In this struggle, perception was everything. For the first decade of this confrontation, the Soviet Union was undeniably winning the battle of perception. In October 1957, Moscow launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, sending shockwaves through Washington. To the global public, the message was unmistakable. A nation that had been largely agrarian just decades earlier was now leading humanity into the cosmos. If Soviet science could launch a satellite into orbit, Soviet industry could build intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking any American city. The technological prestige of communism seemed insurmountable. The humiliations for Washington quickly mounted. The Soviets sent the first dog into orbit, took the first photographs of the far side of the moon, and in April 1961 made Yuri Gagarin the first human being to enter outer space. Around the world, Soviet propaganda banners celebrated Gagarin as a symbol of socialist triumph. In newly independent capitals from Cairo to Jakarta, leaders began to wonder if Moscow held the true blueprint for rapid industrialization and technological supremacy. For the United States, the ideological threat was existential. When President John F. Kennedy took office, he recognized that small victories in space would no longer suffice. Playing catch-up on minor orbital milestones would leave America permanently in Moscow's shadow. In a private memorandum to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy posed a blunt question. Is there any space program where we can beat the Soviets, and how much will it cost? The answer came from NASA leadership. The only arena where the United States had a realistic chance of leapfrogging Soviet momentum was a mission so difficult, so vastly expensive, that both superpowers would essentially have to start from the exact same starting line. That target was the moon. In May 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and announced the audacious goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. On the surface, the rhetoric soared with idealism. Yet declassified White House recordings later revealed Kennedy's true motivation. In a meeting with NASA Administrator James Webb, Kennedy made his priority crystal clear. Everything we do ought to be tied to getting to the moon ahead of the Russians. He admitted that space science was not his personal passion, but beating the Soviets was a national imperative. The strategic genius of Apollo lay not just in the hardware, but in how the United States chose to build it. Rather than operating entirely through state-run military bureaus like the Soviet space program, Washington distributed Apollo contracts across tens of thousands of private American companies, universities, and research institutions. Boeing, North American Aviation, Grumman, and IBM became the industrial pillars of the mission. The project was designed as a living advertisement for American industrial capitalism, demonstrating that a free market economy could coordinate 400,000 civilian workers and 20,000 independent contractors more efficiently than a centralized Soviet command economy. The economic scale was unprecedented for a peacetime effort. At its peak, NASA consumed more than 4% of the entire federal budget. Over $25 billion, amounting to well over $200 billion in today's currency, was funneled into building the infrastructure of lunar exploration. Every dollar spent was intended to signal to the world that American economic reserves were virtually limitless, capable of sustaining massive social programs, fighting the Cold War, and financing interplanetary travel simultaneously. Yet the greatest contrast between the two rivals was how they chose to present their programs to the global public. The Soviet space program was shrouded in absolute military secrecy. Launches were only announced to the world after they had already succeeded. If a mission failed, it was erased from official history or quietly buried. Cosmonauts were treated as state secrets until they returned as decorated heroes. The Kremlin operated on a doctrine that could not tolerate the public appearance of vulnerability. The United States made a radically different, high-risk gamble: absolute transparency. NASA broadcast its launches, its near disasters, and its public setbacks lived to international audiences. When 3 astronauts died on the launch pad during the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, the disaster was debated openly in Congress and reported honestly across global news networks. While this openness exposed American flaws in real time, it created something far more valuable than a record of perfection. It generated undeniable credibility. When America claimed a victory, the world knew it was real because they had watched every step of the struggle. This strategy culminated in the decision to televise the Apollo 11 lunar landing live. The United States Information Agency, the propaganda arm of the U.S. government, coordinated an unprecedented international media operation. Giant screens were erected in public squares from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. Radio Voice of America broadcast running commentary in dozens of languages. Washington was betting the entire prestige of the Western world on a live television broadcast where an engine failure or an unrecoverable crash would be witnessed by hundreds of millions of people in real time. When the Eagle touched down and Neil Armstrong spoke his famous words, the psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. By declaring the landing a victory for all mankind, the United States executed a masterclass in soft power diplomacy. The American flag was planted in the lunar soil, but the plaque left behind read, "We came in peace for all mankind." America had successfully framed its supreme national and ideological victory as a gift to the entire human species, casting itself not as an aggressive military empire, but as the benevolent vanguard of human civilization. Behind the scenes in Moscow, the response was one of quiet devastation. The Soviet Union had spent years attempting to build its own lunar rocket, the colossal N-1. But plagued by decentralized leadership rivalries, insufficient funding, and a series of catastrophic unmanned launch explosions, the Soviet lunar program fell apart in total secrecy. While the Kremlin officially claimed it had never intended to race to the moon, Soviet scientists and military leaders understood that the ideological mantle of technological leadership had decisively slipped away. The geopolitical dividends of the Apollo program unfolded over the next 2 decades. The sheer technological and computing infrastructure developed for the moon missions catalyzed the American computer revolution, laying the groundwork for Silicon Valley and cementing American economic dominance for the late 20th century. World leaders who had once looked to Moscow for industrial inspiration increasingly turned to Washington, convinced that the American combination of open democracy, capitalist enterprise, and technological innovation was the only sustainable path to the modern world. The moon landing remains one of the greatest engineering feats in human history, an enduring testament to what scientific dedication can achieve. But stripped of its nostalgic romance, Apollo was ultimately a geopolitical instrument designed to settle the Cold War without firing a single nuclear missile. It proved that in the arena of global dominance, the most devastating weapon is not always the power to destroy an enemy, but the ability to capture the imagination of the entire planet.